What's 9 times 9? Odds are the answer just popped into your head, instantly, no effort at all. Which is kind of amazing, because you probably learned that fact 20, 30, maybe 40 years ago. Now compare that to the last book you read, or the last online course you took. How much of that can you still recall? Yeah, that's the problem. Anytime we learn something new, we start forgetting it almost immediately, and within a few weeks, most of it is just gone. But your times tables never left, and that's not an accident. It's because of how you learned them. In this video, I'll show you how to use that same technique deliberately to make anything you learn stick. This process of forgetting was first plotted on a graph by a German psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus, and the curve I'm referring to looks something like this. Essentially, we learn something new, then, over a relatively short period of time, what we learn is lost along an exponential decay, until a few weeks later, we've basically forgotten almost everything. So, is there a way to interrupt this pattern of forgetting that we all experience? Well, of course, there's a couple of strategies. There's what I'll call the hard, ineffective way, and then there's the better strategy, which is much more effective and less time-consuming, which I'll cover in a moment. So, what's the hard way, and why am I even mentioning the hard way? Well, the hard way to learn things, it's the way that most of us have studied all of our life. It's what we did in school. We reread things, we review our notes, maybe we highlight or underline things, and then we generally cram if there's a test involved. The problem with this approach is that it doesn't work very well. It may get you through a test, but weeks later you've forgotten what you've studied. But here's the thing. There's a much better strategy for learning things that actually works and takes less time. So, what's a better strategy? It's called spaced repetition, and it's a combination of two important concepts: retrieval practice and spacing. The most effective way to learn something isn't to reread something, it's to actively try and recall something from our memory. Remember that 9 times 9 question from the start of this video? That's exactly what this is. You learned your times tables by being asked a question and actively recalling the answer from memory over and over again, or what's called retrieval practice. It's testing yourself, but it's not testing to measure what you know, it's testing as a learning tool. And over the last 50-plus years, cognitive psychologists have shown in hundreds of studies that retrieval practice is one of the most effective tools for learning new things. So how do you test yourself as a way to learn new things? Well, one common way that you've almost definitely used is flashcards. You've got a question on one side and the answer on the other, and you use the card to test your knowledge. So, should you just use flashcards to learn all the things you want to know? Well, using flashcards by themselves isn't the most effective study strategy. For example, it's impractical for you to make 20 flashcards a day and then review each of those flashcards every day. First of all, after say 10 days of doing this, you'd have 200 flashcards that you'd be trying to study every day, and 20 days later, you'd have 400 flashcards. And very quickly, you can see that studying all your flashcards every day would soon get out of hand. So, what's the problem with just reviewing flashcards over and over again? Well, for one thing, it's a waste of time to repeatedly review a flashcard that you've already committed to memory. It would be more effective for you to focus your limited time on the flashcards that you don't yet have committed to memory. This gets me to the next part of an effective study strategy, which is known as the spacing effect. So, what's this spacing effect? Well, the rate at which you tend to forget things can be plotted on a curve of forgetting, which we saw earlier. It's effectively an exponential decay curve. And what's interesting about this curve of forgetting is that we can predict just about when something you've learned will fall out of memory. In other words, if you wait to review something until you get to about this point in the curve, odds are, with a little bit of effort and struggle, you'll likely be able to recall what you studied. At this point, after successfully recalling what you've learned, you've strengthened the memory and made it more durable. And effectively, you've reset the curve of forgetting to this point up here, where you can easily recall whatever it is you are studying. And take a look at the slope of this new curve of forgetting. It's flatter than this earlier curve, which means you're going to remember what you just reviewed for a longer period of time. And if you repeat this process of waiting some period of time and then reviewing or testing yourself, each successive curve is flatter, which means you remember for longer and longer periods of time. So, in summary, the most effective learning strategy is a combination of test yourself, retrieval practice, and spacing out the interval at which you test yourself. The combination of these two strategies, retrieval practice and spacing, is called spaced repetition, which I referred to earlier, and it's one of the most effective, best-supported strategies we know of. Okay, I bet I know what you're thinking right now. You're probably wondering, in practice, how would you use spaced repetition? In other words, how would you know when you should review your flashcards to fully take advantage of the retrieval and spacing techniques? Well, doing it manually is a real chore, and frankly, isn't really practical. However, there is software designed just for this purpose, just for spaced repetition. The first software I'll mention that fully supports spaced repetition is called Anki. It's personalized software for creating your own electronic flashcards. Anki will show you one side of the flashcard, the question side, then you'll try and answer the question. Then, based on how well you were able to recall the answer, you'll grade yourself. And based on that grade, Anki will automatically space out the flashcard to an appropriate future date. In other words, if you remembered the answer well, Anki will set up this card to be reviewed a bit further out in the future, just about when you'd start to forget the answer. So, basically, you'd see the card again, right around here on the curve of forgetting. On the other hand, if you didn't remember the flashcard very well, Anki would set up the card to be reviewed sometime much sooner, potentially even in the same study session if you didn't remember the answer well at all. So, with Anki, which by the way is free desktop software, you just add your flashcards, review them when Anki tells you to, and then based on how well your recall was, the cards get appropriately scheduled out into the future. There's one other piece of software you can use to support spaced repetition, and that software is called Habident. So what's different about Habident? Well, Habident employs spaced repetition for the classroom environment. In other words, it's used by teachers to create flashcards, or essentially quiz-style questions, and then the teacher assigns the questions to their class, and the students answer the questions, which are automatically graded and rescheduled for further review at the most ideal time for each individual student. Habident takes this powerful learning strategy and allows teachers to use it with all their students. By the way, if your kids aren't using spaced repetition in the classroom, you should probably mention Habident to your kids' teachers so they can start using the most effective study strategy with their students. So, if you want to really learn something using the most effective strategy, you should use Anki for personal study and Habident in a classroom environment. You can find links to both Anki and Habident in the description of this video.